We're going to look at what's called cropping and sizing and do a little bit of a magazine cover build here as an example. And what you want to do when you're saving images for a specific use, you want to try and be as efficient with the file size as possible. And if you do know what size that image needs to be in order to go into a document, it's ideal to have that image preset for the document. Sometimes it's nice when you bring something into Illustrator or InDesign, an image, into one of those. It's nice to have some flexibility with it and be able to move it around in an image frame in InDesign, for example, or mask it in Illustrator. But often and ideally, we know exactly what size it needs to be. It's been developed in Photoshop, and then we crop and size it to go into InDesign or Illustrator. And typically this is done with InDesign, especially with magazine development and publication design. Now, one of the things you do want to remember first is that even if you do know the size that you may want something, you want to work on it, do your Photoshop work prior to the crop in size. So you want to work at the highest resolution you can and with the most area around that image you can. And then you do your adjustments, your graphics, your edits to the image. And then once you're settled on all that, save that version, then do the crop and save it out in order to place it into one of the other programs. In the end, you're maintaining the uncropped version with all of the live layers for adjustments, and then you also have that saved out version that you're just placing in and using for production. And that would typically be in a print environment. That would be a TIFF. So we would make all of our adjustments, do essentially our editing artwork in Photoshop, and maybe that's that you end up having a few layers or you have dozens of layers. But in any case, you do all of that work, then you crop and size, and then you save out as a TIFF with no active layers. And that way you're sending out an efficient file size-wise in terms of how much space it's taking up, but you also have the live layer version that you can come back to and readjust if necessary. Sometimes, of course, we can place a PSD into InDesign. In fact, I do that a lot, and it is in some cases fairly inefficient depending on the size of those PSDs, but it does allow me to come back to it and work on it as I need to. Ultimately, though, if I know I'm sending out to production and I know I'm not going to be making any adjustments, I try to make my files as small and efficient as possible. And that's when, of course, I make a flattened. It's called flattened when we've removed all of the layers. I make a flattened TIFF that I place in InDesign. I'm just going to go into InDesign now. And I have a cover document here. This is a 16.75 by 10.875. So it would be 8 and 5/8, I think. This would be the cover size. Half of this would be 8.625. So I'm just going to bring a guide to the halfway point so I can get my cover size. So what this is the front and back cover. It's one sheet. It's not separate pages. We can see that in InDesign here, it's the first page is essentially the outside, and then the second page is the inside cover. So I'm going to bring a guide to half, and I have my rulers on. If your rulers aren't on, you can do Command R, and I'll bring the guide out. And if I'm having trouble finding half, I can look at the little number beside my cursor, and it will tell me when I'm at 0.625. The other thing you can do if you really want to be quick about it, just get a rectangle, go from your bleed guide to bleed guide, and that gives you a center point. You can see I was actually off center there. So I'm glad I did that. So I can move the guide to correct center. There we go. So correct center on this is actually, I'm going to make sure of my math there, 8.375. Okay, so I'll delete that. Now I have my guide at center, so I'm going to make another shape, and this is going to give me the crop size. So remember, we don't want to just include the page, we want to include also to the bleed guide there. So I'm going to go from the center, and I'll hold my space bar down while I draw this to make sure I'm dead center. So I'm moving it with my space bar down. I can move it, let go of the space bar, and finish my draw. And I'll go all the way to the bleed guide there. And I'll just give this a color so that we can see it. And there's my box. So then I'll go to my transform tool up at the top here, and it tells me it's including bleed at the top, bottom, and right side. It's 8.5 wide by 11.125 high. So that would be my image size if I was truly cropping to size. So when I talk about cropping to size, I'm going to do that for a moment, and then I'll undo in Photoshop what I do. But we have 8.5 by 11.125. Going back to Photoshop, let's say this was all done. This is my cover, very blank cover. I'll go to the crop tool here. And the crop tool, when you bring it up, depends if you've used your Photoshop or not. It probably says ratio. And up at the top, you've got these fields. So by default, it's likely gone to ratio, but we know the size and we know that we want it at 300 dpi. We know our resolution. This image in early image assessment, we see that it's probably not ideal for that. We're going to be doing some upsampling, which we don't want to do, but for demo reasons, that's fine. So we're going to go to width, height, and resolution here because we know what those are. And these fields, although they're unfortunately not named, they're reflective of what's happening in this selection here. So we have the width, the height, and the resolution. Before you enter your resolution, be sure that you have pixels per inch selected. If you have a Canadian download of the Adobe program, this is your first time opening Photoshop or using this part of Photoshop, it may very well default to pixels per centimeter. It's just a default that it does. And that ends up being roughly half of the resolution we need. So we want to do pixels per inch. In fact, it wouldn't be half, it would be double. So we want to make sure in any case that we're at pixels per inch, and because we're doing print, standard print resolution is 300, so we'll enter that. And then we knew that our crop was including bleed, it's not bleeding across the gutter in InDesign there, so we knew that our crop size was 8.5. And I'm going to put IN. Typically you don't if you're already working in inches in the units. My ruler here is set to inches, but I'm still going to put IN, and you can see it actually did set to PX, that's pixels. So I want to be very sure. I always do it by habit. I'm just going to do IN, and then I'm going to do the 11.125 IN. And you can see the frame, the crop frame is adjusting here according to what I enter. So I've entered width of 8.5, the height of 11.125. I'm going to make sure of that. That's correct. And resolution of 300 pixels per inch, making sure that that's set to inches. And then if I want to clear this out or anything, I just press the clear button. So once that has set, I can, of course, reduce the scale of this. And I wouldn't want to if I don't have a very, very high resolution image, because the smaller area of that image I'm asking more of the resolution of, the more upsampling I'm going to have to do. So I'm going to try and keep this at what it's at. And I'm just going to move this down so I have enough room for a masthead. I don't really know what I'm going to be doing here as far as a cover layout. I don't have a plan, but in this case, for demo reasons, I'm going to bring a masthead in eventually and do some changes. So I'm going to be cropping to size this area. So once I click that check mark, it's going to by all rights, it should set to the correct size of what I have here. So I'll hit the check mark. And because it took a little bit because it was doing some upsampling, which again, that means it's adding in some data, some pixels that didn't exist. So it was doing some guessing there and trying to make as clear an upsample as it could. And it's not the highest quality image to begin with, so we can see that it upsampled and really didn't help things, but that's okay. Command 0, reset that. So to confirm, we can look at our properties panel, or I'm just going to go to image size and 8.5, 11 point, you'll sometimes see this 0.127. We set it at 0.125, but being pixels, it went just a little bit larger, which is, it's not going to matter. And then we have 300 DPI. So that's good. So of course, that is what we would do after we did the development, but I'm still going to go through with the save. So let's say you've got all these layers, you've done a beautiful cover, you've done what you need to do in Photoshop. And remember, when you do a cover like this, you would do the image works in Photoshop, and you would bring that image into InDesign and add in, if you weren't going to have any interaction with the image in with the masthead in the image, then you wouldn't even add the masthead. You would just do the image. So bringing any text, any masthead logo or anything into Photoshop isn't necessary unless you're doing image interaction with that content. Ideally, you save all of that content for InDesign or Illustrator when you're doing the cover. And really any layouts, of course, even in a magazine, for example, you're going to do the image works in Photoshop, save it out, place it into InDesign, and place typewritten content around it. Again, unless that type is going to be interacting with the imagery, then we likely do have to bring it into Photoshop. There are ways with Illustrator and even InDesign to mask content around if you're doing that, but if you're really doing a strict merge of content and imagery, Photoshop is where you would do that. And then you would save it out. So we're going to pretend this is all we need. We'll go to File and Save a Copy. And in this case, I don't want any layers, so I'm going to save that out as a TIFF. And what a TIFF is essentially the highest quality image we can get without any sacrifice of, really we're removing the layers. I'm going to click the layers off here, and we're creating a file that is not taking up too much space, so it's not sacrificing too much space in our computer, but it's also maintaining the highest print quality. We do not want to print JPEGs or PNGs, so you wouldn't save out an image as a JPEG or a PNG. Really, you only want to be using in InDesign for print purposes a TIFF or a PSD, and a TIFF is ideal for space savings. So we would save this out as a TIFF. I'm not going to follow through on it, but we would name it, and then when you go to InDesign, you place that TIFF in. In fact, I will probably now just for later tutorials, and I'm saving as a copy. So it's going to retain my PSD here that I'm working on. So I'll just save that. And it'll give me this, and by default, you can typically leave all of these. Sometimes if you're going to be moving this between computers, leaving it at Macintosh will help. I always leave it at the defaults that I have here, and I purposefully chose to discard the layers anyway, so it knows that it's doing that. I'll say okay. So I have that TIFF for later if I want to use it. But now I'm going to undo because I'm not ready to crop to size. I want to do a couple of other things tutorial wise here. So I'm going to go back and make sure I remove that crop. And I think I did just with that single undo, but I'm going to be sure. I'm going to check my history window here in case I did anything further. So there's my save and crop, and you can see some of this stuff we've done earlier with this image. So the history is kind of good just to reference, or even if you need to, jump right back to something else that you've done. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is show a little bit about how we can manipulate this image into, in this case, a cover. So I'm going to paste in, this is a masthead logo that I copied from an Illustrator document, and it's when we paste, we can paste directly from Illustrator with proper vector art right into Photoshop. And what it's going to ask us is if we want to paste it in as a smart object, which will maintain the vector qualities. So I can paste it in as a smart object and essentially size it larger or smaller all I want, and it will retain its clarity. Because it's maintaining vector qualities, it's not yet rasterized or pixel based. So if I did that, smart object, I have much more flexibility. If I wanted to do something with that, if I wanted to do some quote unquote Photoshop stuff, then I would have to rasterize that layer. So I'm going to paste this in as a smart object because I don't believe that I'm going to need to do much to it. But if I do, I would rasterize it. Pixels, I would paste it in and it would let me size it. And then when I say OK, that's it. I would actually be pressing return or hitting a check mark. And then I can only go smaller because if I go larger, I lose that clarity. So for a logo, a smart object is ideal. We can also get the path. So as a vector item, it will ask if do we want the path, or it'll create a shape layer. And the shape layer would be essentially a mask that we can shape mask something into, an image into that actual graphic. So I'm just going to for now choose smart object. I'll say OK, and I'll scale it up. And because it's a smart object, it's retaining that vector quality, even though we can see some pixels here while I'm scaling it, because it's sort of in a hybrid environment at the moment. We can see that it's still letting me scale. I'm going to put it up here as though it's a cover. And this is, again, this is the pre-cropped size. So I'll hit the check mark there or press return. And if I zoom in on that, we can see it is pixel based because it's in a pixel environment, but it's retaining its vector qualities. We can see it says over in the layers, vector smart object. So because it's in Photoshop, it shows pixels, but it's not actually rasterized. I know that's a little confusing when you don't see that clarity that you would see in a vector environment. But I can scale that. I'll do Command T. I can increase the size of that, and it will still retain that quality. It'll still show some pixels, but it's not lowering in resolution because it's technically not rasterized and taking part in the resolution of this document yet. So if I wanted to do something, for example, if I wanted to mask it out, so I can make a mask on it and it lets me do that. But if I wanted to do anything else that pertained with effects or image adjustments and so on, eventually you're going to find you simply have to rasterize that layer, and right clicking on it and choosing rasterize layer will turn it into a proper pixel based graphic. So I'm not going to do that right now. Now if I was actually making this into a cover, I look at it and from a design standpoint I see a couple of opportunities, and I don't like the point of tension that's happening here where the building is meeting the W. So I'm going to switch the image here. I'm going to actually select this image, the layer itself, and I'm going to go to Edit, and I'll go to Transform and down to Flip Horizontal. There's nothing on this building that's indicating really that it was flipped. There's no typography or anything, so I can get away with it pretty easily. So I'll flip it. And I'm kind of just playing around here, but I can see where the angle of the A may work well with the building. So if I want to turn this a bit, because this image isn't quite aligning with the A, and there's that layer that I'm not currently using, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to do Command T, select it on the layer, I'll do Command T. I'm going to angle it very slightly here. I'm actually going to move it up, and I'm going to try and match exactly that A, just to give some sort of relationship between the type and the building. And I'll press Return or Enter, or just click that check mark up top, and that will activate that edit. Now I'll move this into place. Don't worry about what's showing here, because we're going to fill that in. So I'm going to move it just with my arrow key. I'm on my move tool over here. I'm selected on that layer. I have no selections made. So I'll move it over and I'll kind of try and line that up to take part with the A. A little bit of graphic unity there. So we've got some area here that we've obviously, if I command click on the thumbnail, we can see where that layer is landed, where that image is landed on that layer because I turned it. We want to fill that in. What I'm going to do is, probably the easiest part is to make a new layer. So I'll click on this bottom layer, click the new layer icon, and then I'm just going to fill this layer beneath with that same color. So I'll go over to my swatches here, and I'll click on that, and it gives me this color picker. I'm going to click on this color, that background color. It's solid all the way around, so that's a good thing, that's helpful. I'll say OK. And there's great key commands here. While I'm clicked on that layer, I don't have a selection, but if I did, it would just fill that selection. But I'm going to do Option Delete to fill the foreground color, or I could do Command Delete to fill in the background color. So I have the gray that I sampled from here. So I'm just going to click on that layer. I'm going to do Option Delete, and it fills that. And if I want, I could merge these, but I may find that at some time I want to angle that again. So I'm just going to leave these separate. As you get more layers, sometimes it is nice to start naming them, especially if you're working in an environment where others may be working on the document. I find that it's ideal to name your layers just so that if someone else does have to work on the document, which is quite common, they know what's going on. The more organized you can be for yourself, that's great, and the more organized you can be for others, even better. So I'm just doing this for tutorial, so I'm not going to spend the time naming layers at the moment. Now from a design standpoint, one of the things I may want to change, I'm looking at this and looking at how the image interacts with the typography. So I've got my rulers here. I'm going to click on the ruler and drag out a guide. And I'm going to drag it to the T there and just see if there's a way that I can line these up. Now that vertical looks pretty good, and that angle that I did down below, the angle of the building in accordance to the A, that also looked pretty good. So I'm going to see if I can get them to line up. And what I ideally would like to do is align the edge of the building with the T, and I'm going to scale this up, which I shouldn't be doing because it's upsampling, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to try and get this to seat so that it's aligned with the T and the, I got to remember not to press Shift, and the edge of that A, and we'll see how that looks. So I start to see things like these, and I kind of have to see how it looks, even though I'm spending a little extra time on tutorial. But these are things you look for, especially between the interaction between image and type. So I'll leave it there for now, but that looks pretty good. That came together nicely. So I scaled it, made that adjustment. I'll turn off the guide, here, and I'm going to keep that guide there, but command and semicolon will hide that guide. So now I've got a little bit going on with the cover. I can still turn this masthead off, and I think what I'm going to do is actually leave it on, and were I to save it out and bring it into InDesign to lay out my cover lines or whatever else I needed on the cover, I would bring the PSD into InDesign and then get my masthead set. So there's a little bit of back and forth. You save the PSD where it's at, bring it into InDesign. It's not going to be cropped to size, but it will let me place my masthead as a proper vector logo in InDesign, paste it into InDesign from Illustrator. Then eventually, once I get everything set, I can come back into Photoshop, turn off my my masthead in here because I don't want a rasterized masthead. I want it as crisp in print as possible. It doesn't have to interact with the image directly in this case. And then I would do my crop and size and place that in as well, knowing that I'm working from the top down like we cropped it earlier. So this is kind of the process you go through, and then again, if you're doing any adjustments to the image, then you want to, of course, keep in mind layers, selection, and all that. And even the more I look at this, I start to see that although technically this is aligned, it doesn't actually optically look aligned. So I would be making some more adjustments. Always remember you're going for optical alignment, not technical alignment. So just moving that over, even though it's not technically aligned, it's getting closer to optical alignment. And that's just the aspect of negative space that's happening with the building image, the T, the space between the T and the A. All of those negative space aspects are they're kind of creating a little optical illusion. They're throwing off the alignment. So we're always trying to make things appear optically aligned rather than technically aligned.